Don't do this to me. Good morning, everyone. This is Fran Lewis. This is MJ Network, MJ in memory of my sister Marcia Joyce. And I am thrilled to say that the author of Salvation of Henry Maxwell is here. Good morning, and how are you?
I'm doing fine, Fran. How are you doing this morning?
Hanging in there by a thread, but okay. So, this novel is really great, and somehow my cleaning service took it. So I have the book, I have the review in front of me, I have the questions, and they took the book because they liked it without telling me. So, what made you create a novel based on a mansion in a Gothic time period?
Well, I'm kind of a product of the 60s a little bit as a teenager. And I remember going to movies with Vincent Price and those folks back in those days, the matinees. And that seemed to me something that stuck up with me, that memory of that time. And so I thought about, well, what about writing about someone from that time? So I kind of fabricated a character based on some of those folks that were in those gothic horror movies back then, and that's kind of how Henry was born.
Well, I know that this is the hardest thing in the world. Henry Maxwell was 85 years old, and he was declared needing a conservator to handle his estate and monetary affairs. I think that's the hardest thing for somebody to have to realize.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, thinking, it doesn't matter what age you're at, but if somebody is kind of trying to look after you, you're trying to wonder why. But he was kind of boxed in with his affairs at that age because he was going through some tremendous grief that he had harbored over 40 some odd years. The grief being the death of his wife back in the late 60s. So he really wasn't being able to handle his affairs. So he was ordered by the courts to have a conservator monitor them for him. And that's where the novel sort of starts with her being in a young woman attorney being involved as the conservator.
I think the hardest thing also is how did Jessica got roped into taking the job as his lawyer and conservator, and that's hard. It's a real
Yeah,
responsibility. I had to do it for my mother, so I know.
yeah, it's probably tough, and uh, being a young attorney, getting thrust into something like that with somebody who's 50 years older than you, and trying to figure out what exactly your chore is, that would be really tough to do. But she had no choice. She had a job, and she had to keep her job. And the interesting thing about this is she was forced to move into his mansion to kind of monitor his his affairs, and that kind of set both him and her off on the wrong foot. But as the novel progressed, that changed quite quickly.
It's sad. He was 85 years old and he realized it, but he has disadvantages. But this is something based also on the death of his wife. So why do we know that Marcia hid the truth about Henry?
Well, I'm not sure she hid the truth about Henry.
Yeah.
Uh, she, Marcia was her supervisor at the law firm that she worked with, and she wanted somebody to be involved as a live-in conservator for a while who had a background in psychology because they were trying to figure out
Yeah.
why Henry was doing the things he did, and she did. Jessica, the young attorney, did have a background in psychology, so that's why she ended up being sent there to be the conservator.
That's a hard job. Tell us about him and why was he considered one of the greatest actors of his time?
Well, you obviously remember people like Vincent Price back in that day, who was absolutely, one of a kind. And Henry's kind of molded after that character.
Mm.
Uh, like I said, I was a product of the 60s. I love those old films, those old, Vincent Price type movies. Follow the House Usher and all those things that were big back then. And so he was basically a character, a actor on par with Vincent. In fact, Vincent was one of his competitions back in that day. So that's if you remember that time, you'll get a feeling for Henry.
So he wasn't happy about having Jessica there, right? For him,
Not
he
at
didn't
first.
want her there. And
Excuse
then
me.
at night, people do this. They think that the person that died is really out there somewhere. So he goes out to, and what is he leaves. That's
Well,
that,
yeah,
that's not impossible.
no. He started having visions of
Yeah.
his long lost wife who died in the 60s. And he started going to the garden and actually seeing things that reminded him of her, and actually starting to see her. And she was like calling him. So it was a ghostly presence of his dead wife. And that's why he always went to the garden at midnight, usually, and he would rendezvous with her. In his mind, he was rendezvousing with her. But as the novel progresses, was he really rendezvousing with him or with her, or was it just a fabric of his imagination? So that's how the novel progresses, and that's for the reader to figure out.
Well, that's scary. So his mental state was deteriorating. But what is it about this Lady Julia sarcophagus that comes at the top of every single chapter, just about?
Well, that's a a book that was written back in the Victorian age. I've had some really interesting comments on that.
Yeah.
People think that was an actual real novel. And no, it was not a real novel. It was a fictional novel in my fictional novel. So at the top of some of the chapters, there is a little scene from that novel. It's kind of like it's an epigraph type of thing at the top of the chapter. Mm-hmm. And if you read that epigraph of Lady Julia's sarcophagus, then if you read the chapter, you'll see a relationship. Yeah. So that's what I was trying to pull as the novel progresses. Some of the chapters have that. You read that, then you read the chapter, and you say, "Oh my gosh, it's like paralleling what happened in that novel."
I know, it's really different. And those of you that are listening, you got to read it because we're not going to tell you.
That's exactly. Yeah. We can't give too much away here.
I know. But I have to say that I'm really lucky because this way of doing the review interviews are great, because the minute I post it, it's on YouTube right now, but the minute I post it on LinkedIn, I get about 50 views right away.
Well, that's good.
It is good. When I get to download it and pray that I don't mess it up. But yeah, I get a lot. Last week I got 119 on DP Lyle's views, all of it out of nowhere, and people were reading the book. So we have hope here. So how does David come into play, and who is Tasha, and what happened to him?
Well, David is a professor of film studies at UCLA. Yeah. He gets to know Jessica because he has an interest in those old gothic celluloid movies of the 50s and 60s. And so that's how he gets involved in this thing. And he starts to analyze some of Henry's works back then. And so they get a relationship going of him being involved in trying to find more out about some of those films, especially Lady Julia's sarcophagus, which was a film that was never finished by Henry. And that is a real key to the novel here, is why it was not finished and where is this movie? Has anybody got a copy of it, a celluloid copy? So that's kind of a mystery within the whole novel.
Well, I'm going to leave out the next question because I don't want anybody to ask me this or find out. So tell us how does she meet David, and how does he become part of the story?
Well, David gets brought into the situation by a man that dies or is actually killed, who was an editor of some of those films back in the 60s. And he's brought in, brought into it because he wanted to look at this man's collection of old celluloid movies. And when he looks at him after the man was killed, he finds that one film is missing, and that's Lady Julie's sarcophagus. So he learns that Jessica is the conservator of Henry, and this could have been one of Henry's films. So that's how he gets brought into the situation. So he wants to meet Henry and see what he can learn from him, and then they kind of team together through the movie to analyze some of his wants and needs in the films that Henry did, and it helps her start to understand Henry a little bit more.
So we have Dart, who I love, and David, who I love. So they decide to investigate, and then they find some hidden passages. I love when a book has something that nobody sees.
Oh yeah, there's always hidden passages in these
That's cool. That's
mansions
so cool.
and so forth. You mentioned Dart. He's a friend of David's, and what's happening also right now in the novel is there's been some serial killings that are pointing to Henry because they are mimicking, the killings mimic scenes from some of his old movies. And the very interesting part of that is the killings, the present day killings of these people or from scenes from the old movies actually are killed at the same location where the scenes were filmed. So there's a connection here, and Dart and David are just they're going crazy trying to figure out why is this happening, and is Henry really involved in these killings?
So how does Henry really feel about Jessica? Because he's not happy. You have to like her in a sense.
Well, yeah, they're starting to get a relationship going. They're both young people, and but they're also working in tandem, try to help to figure out Henry here and see why these killings are happening. And essentially, Henry gets arrested for them, as the reader will discover.
So who is Alden Silvers, and what's his story? And the next question is really says it all, sort of.
Well, he's the one that runs Henry's fan club, which is surprisingly there's still a fan club somewhat 50 years later. But he's also from David's research and detective work. It looks like he might be involved in these killings that have implicated Henry, because they really are now starting to see that Henry couldn't have done these things. But so everything points to Arlen, and they're wondering why he would do these killings. And they figure it out because there were 3 films, and you'll probably see that in your questions, that were done by Henry, which he loathed. He hated these films because they kind of got out of the Gothic realm and more into the slasher realm that was starting to take off in the late 60s, early 70s. And so he hated these films, but Arlen, the fan club president, loved those films. So that was, something that Henry hated, but Arlen loved him. And so that pointed to Arlen as being maybe the one that really did these killings. So that's just another detective plot kind of thing that's happening in this story.
I really like Henry. He's really a very powerful character, but at times I'm not really sure if he's faking being disoriented or if he really is. And then we
Well,
have to get to Lillian, because to be very honest, I love gardens.
Yeah, it's well, you can imagine this place that Henry lives in. It's a huge, it's really a castle, and that kind of reflects on his life as a Gothic horror star way back in the 60s. So it does have passageways under it. It does have wonderful gardens that have been, unfortunately, when Jessica showed up, they were in disarray because he had not had anything upkeep on the place done for several months and maybe a year or two. but she comes in to try to straighten things out. So,
Well, how does he blame himself for her death? And tell us about her work in the garden. I really wish there would have been a picture because I love gardens. It would have been something beautiful to see.
yeah, it's the garden was amazing. Once she got it straightened
Yeah.
out and up, starting to look like a real garden. It has a special part to the garden, which is a statuary garden of Greek gods. And that's where Henry would go at night to rendezvous with his deceased wife's ghost. So hopefully the reader will get a feel for that garden as I tried to portray it with all the statues of the Greek gods and so forth. And you can imagine being there at night with the moon shining and glistening off of the statues. It brought out a lot, and it brought out Lillian's ghost pretty well. So hopefully the reader will get the same feeling that I had when I wrote it.
So, how did his films come to be an important part of the book? Because David realizes something about them. Without
About
saying what it was, David realizes something. I was reading the review on my phone.
what was that about? He realizes what now?
There were two films, he said. There was something
Oh,
about them, yeah.
yeah. That's probably the trilogy films I think you're talking about. They see the connection between the films that where the scenes had some pretty gruesome killings, and then they saw that some really gruesome killings were happening in the present day. So that's where they start to think that Henry might be involved in them, but then he's not involved in them because Arlen Silver's, the fan club president, seems to know more about it than they do. So that's basically another. There's like two or three different subplots in this thing, but they all tie together as the novel progresses towards the end, and the reader will see that. And hopefully, there's no loose ends here. I mean, I don't believe there is, but they just tie together. And Henry is no longer seen as the one who did these things, but he's got a couple of things on his mind. He's trying to figure out why his wife died back in the 60s,
Yeah,
and he comes to the conclusion she was murdered. So
yeah.
he's playing detective at 85 years old also.
I agree with him because as I read it, and I couldn't put the book down once I started it, which is great for eye strain.
Yeah. Well, it's great that
There are
yeah,
quite a
and
few books that I put down, and there was one book that I got last week that took me. It only takes me 2 hours to read something. But when
wow.
I got this book last week, it took me 3 days. That must tell you how good it was.
Well, I
Okay,
appreciate that. I really do
so
appreciate that, Fran.
my mother, took speed reading when I was in high school, and then I had to read 10 books a week for my
Oh,
mother. She
wow.
told me, yeah, and take notes. And you know what? That's probably the worst thing you could do to a person, but the best thing that happened. Because when I read a book, I circle, underline, and take notes. That's how I know how to ask the questions, and I have the book memorized. She tortured me, but I guess for the right reasons.
I guess it worked out because I tell you, when you sent me these questions, I looked at all these and it says, what, 52 questions.
You
My
know, I read the
gosh.
book.
Yeah.
So who is Tom Caswell, and what's his deal with Henry? Because I don't trust him.
Well, you're not supposed to trust him. And
That's good. You see, I got that right.
yeah, you'll find out that he's an important little cog in this book. And I'm not going to say why he's an important little cog in this book, but he was a young boy back in the day when Henry was doing the films because his dad worked on the films as a special effects guy. And so Henry had known him all these years, and he comes off trying to be a friend of Henry's now. But we won't go any further. The reader will soon figure that out as Tom is mentioned more in the book and why he is there.
Now this is a little bit unusual. Henry is constantly arrested several times, and I like the guy. So who are the two detectives? One is one way, one is another way. There's
Well,
always one that's bad, and there's always one that just
yeah,
happens
there's
to be
got, you
good.
got to have the good cop, bad cop
Yeah.
duo. And uh, Henry is arrested the first time because he's starting to mimic things from the novel Lady Julia's Sarcophagus uh, for some reason, and the reader will find out he's doing that because he thinks he has to replay that novel, which ended up being a movie of his, which was never released, as his way of getting his final
Mm,
salvation with his wife. Because the last scene of that book,
mm-hmm.
that film was never uh, completed because Henry walked off the set after his wife died. So there's that connection there. And
Mm.
why did he walk off the set? And the reader will discover that.
Now, I know David and Jessica are working hard, but why is D'Angelo different, and how did you create the confrontations? And then Henry is arrested again. Leave this
well,
poor guy alone.
well, he got arrested the second time
Yeah.
because they had evidence that he was the killer of those serial killings that were happening now. And D'Angelo, the detective that's kind of the nasty detective, the bad guy cop person, just he's kind of like a Barney Fife. If you remember some of those things, always knows how to do things, and he's going to do it his way, and da 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 da. And so he's in confrontation with his main supervisor, who is Detective Brown. But so there's a difference between the two. One's trying to be the bad cop, one's trying to be the good cop, and it just adds a little bit of flavor to the detective work as this novel progresses.
So she bails Henry out, but who is you and what is his role related to Henry? And then we have to
Well,
get to what happens to Maxwell. Is like, what?
yeah, Yui is a psychiatrist
Uh
who's
huh.
retired, but he was Lillian's psychiatrist back in the 60s. He was Lillian had all kinds of, well, she had drug problems, I guess, and that's how they think she died back in the 60s. So Yui was her psychiatrist, and he's been kind of a friend of Henry's all these years. But I won't go any further of what Yui's really purpose is in this book, because the reader will find that out towards the end of the book, and we just don't want to give away too many things here.
So who is Koff?
That's Yui. That's Yui. Yui
That's
Koff.
Huey, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the films come into play at the end, and Julia's book. What about her book is important?
What? Lady Julia's sarcophagus?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I
that's.
wanted to read the whole book. I was getting like, oh my God, I got to read this book. It's
I
really
know
good.
people say, "Where's that book? I need to read it too." Well, you look it up. You're not going to
It
find
is
it.
good.
No, but it's kind of the theme that this whole novel works through, because Henry is trying to reenact certain scenes in that book, in that movie, because in his mind how he's going to find salvation at the end of his salvation. To him is ending up in eternity again with his wife, who's a ghostly presence. So in his mind, he has to finish that last scene in that book, in that movie, for
Yeah.
him to accomplish that goal. And that's what drives him through the book to get to that point where he can end up in everlasting eternity with his long lost deceased wife.
Yeah. Well, some of the scenes, parts were missing. So what does David learn at the library And you need somebody like him because he doesn't give up. He's like me. He don't give up until he finds out the answer.
Yeah, yeah. Are you talking
That's
about
it.
David, or are you talking about Henry? Henry has a little library scene with a young girl, but David, he gets information from going to a bookstore that might have a copy of Lady Julia's sarcophagus.
Ah,
So that's how he gets thinking. Now I'm on the trail of why Henry's doing what he's doing, because it's starting to follow that he's been doing things that really are parallel to certain scenes in that book. And so that's why he gets excited about trying to figure out, where can I get a copy of that book? Where can I get a copy of the movie that was never released? And so that's his detective work that he has to do to help Jessica out, who's trying to psychologically figure out Henry, and
mm.
da 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 da. So that kind of brings them together, and uh, it has sprinkling of little plots here and there, but they're all tied together. They all come together kind of cleanly, and we do have a finally climax in this book. It's a
Well,
little confusing, but we do.
I have to bring this one in. I've left it out. So there's a fan club, right?
Hmm.
And a trilogy. So just what part did Henry play? And they're claiming that he took place in two more things that happened to two more people.
Right. Well, that's the trilogy. The three
Yeah,
films that he did not like making back then because they
yeah.
got away from his gothic persona. And then these three films have uh, killings in them that are mimicked by the present killings today in the same locales that they were shot in the film. So that's how Henry gets drug into being maybe the killer. But then, like I mentioned earlier, you got the fan club president where he loved those films. And
Mm.
so then things start to look to him as the killer. And the reader will see that as they progress through this novel. And hopefully they'll uh, think the same thing that that uh, Harlan, the fan club president, was the killer or is the killer, and maybe he is. So we'll see. We'll see as they get into the book.
You don't know. Well, before I forget, Wednesday we have the author of Saving Casey. It's an interesting story about a soldier that wakes up 3 years after becoming to Vietnam with PTSD and what he goes through. On the 17th, I'm doing something very different. We're going to do something about St. Patty's Day, but we're going to do a special dedication for women's history to the memory of Princess Diana. And the book is called Lead Like Diana, and it should be really a special women's history in her memory. On the 26th, the author of Ivy Bones. And to end March with a bang, the #1 interior decorator and designer in the world, Howard Wiggins, takes a stand with whatever he wants to talk about. I learn about Art Deco, and the most. So that's what's coming up next month. If anybody has a new title, I just booked the last ones for May. I'm open for June. I can't believe how many people want to do this. It's really complimentary. It's great. So now let's get back to Jessica. When the heat, why does she disappears, and the tension really got me nervous. So what without saying why they took her, how did you create the scene without giving it away? And I hope somebody finds her.
Who are we talking about? Jessica when she disappears?
Yeah, I love Jessica.
Yeah, she. The three films called the trilogy, the three films that Henry did not like. The first film, there was a killing that mimicked a scene in it, a present day killing that mimicked a scene in that. There was a second film that was another killing that mimicked a scene from one of the movies that Henry was in, based on Lady Julia's sarcophagus, the novel.
Mm.
But then Jessica disappears somehow, and they find out that there was the third film of that trilogy, and there's going to be another one of these killings that's going to happen in that, and that's when David figures out that Jessica might be the victim in that third film. So that's kind of the serial killing plot that drags Henry into it and drags David into it, and now they've got to find out where Jessica is. So I won't go any further on that. Hopefully, the reader will read it and find out, and hopefully they'll it'll all come together at the end of that when Jessica is maybe found. I don't know. I don't want to give away too much here.
No, we can't give
so
it
we'll
away,
see.
But I'm going to make sure people read this. What I did was I posted that I was doing this, then I will post the review everywhere.
Okay.
I guarantee when I post a review on LinkedIn, you're going to get a lot of visits. Everybody reads everything I write. I don't know why, but they do. And if I put the cover on it on Facebook, everybody's going to read it. I've never had that before. When I did just Blog Talk, it was different. But since I've been on Restream, the minute I post, I download the video and it goes to YouTube. I get views and I'm like, oh my god! And then they're reading everything I write. Plus the fact that I went on YouTube this morning. They saved every single video is still on there. This stays on for 2 weeks on Restream, but if I save it, whatever, it's there forever. Makes it even better, so they get to see my poor face at the time. I usually like doing it without me on the other end, but what can I tell you?
Yeah.
So, how does he play hero, and how does he get it? What is Henry's problem with the police? And then we have to go to what happens when Maxwell is arrested. I feel so bad.
Well, he's arrested, but Jessica bails him out.
She's good.
She's a smart attorney. She figures out that he couldn't have done these killings, and because her original job with the law firm that she works for, she was in the criminal division. So she's smart. She goes down to the police station and they go through the scene of how this last killing happened, and she convinces them that he couldn't have done it. So he finally gets released from being arrested, and it's all because of her. And that's where the change between Henry and Jessica happens. Henry did not really like her that much at the beginning. He wanted to get rid of her. But now he sees that she is a young woman who actually opens his heart up a little bit more. And he starts to see that she has empathy, and he starts to have a little bit more feelings, and it brings out a lot of feelings within him that he hadn't had for years since his wife died.
What would happen if Lillian was alive? It would be different, but what would she say to Henry? Would she say to him, get on with your life?
Well, that's what she's trying to kind of say in her ghostly presence is,
yeah, she seems to be there.
I've been gone all these years, and you don't have many years left. So when that happens, we need to be together for eternity, and that's what he wanted anyway. So that's his impetus to continue going to the garden and so forth, because he knows eventually he will end up with her in eternity, hopefully. So that's his impetus to keep going, and they do eventually at the end of the book. Maybe not. Reader will find out.
I know my grandfather, when my grandmother died, was devastated because we were in a hotel and the doctor didn't give her the right medicine, so he sort of killed her.
Yeah.
And they couldn't find him. So when she died, I said to my grandfather, everybody needs you, because without you, the family goes nowhere. So he lasted a little bit, but not long enough. It's sad.
Well, it is. And, people have grief, and people have long-term grief. Some people never get over it, and that's basically Henry's case. And the case with a lot of people. So unless you've ever been in that situation, maybe you can't relate to it, but it's a real thing, and it can stay with you for years.
I know I can't get over the fact that my sister died either from unusual circumstances. So each day I try to do something in her memory, which is
Right.
this. She's the
Right.
MJ Network is after my sister. That's why I do this, because she said I was looking like I weigh 97 pounds. She said, "You look like a fat couch potato. You should, you better do something. Why don't you do a video?" I said, "You got to be kidding me." So she was the reason I did Blog Talk, and she criticized everything I did, which was fine. But when she died, it was like, who's going to yell at me anymore?
Yeah.
Who's going to
Right.
criticize me?
Yeah. You
So
have. Yeah.
how
Yeah.
did you create the fine tension and final scenes? And what is the revelation of what was written? He wrote, I cried at the end. I really did. It was sad.
Well, I had a friend that just read this book, and she said to me, and she's a French Canadian, so she was reading in her second language this book, but she said she cried at the end too, and I said, well, that was the point. I hope people do. I want to see
Yeah.
some tears on the page, but the revelation. Henry writes Jessica a letter after he disappears at the end of the book, and explains a lot of stuff to her, and that just ties so many things together, and a reader will hopefully get that feeling of I don't know what the word is, relief that that's how this should end. But the final chapter is where it
Yeah,
really
that's
ends,
the last
and we
chapter
won't
we
go
will
there.
talk about. Yeah.
We will not go into that at all.
We can't tell
So
anybody
I'm
about
telling
that.
all the readers, if you read this, please don't read the last chapter. Read the book, and then
No,
you could read the last chapter.
I'm not going to give away anything. I wouldn't do that. So is there a sequel coming?
I wish there was, but no.
Oh, so
Uh,
sad. I
you know,
wanted to see where you put
it
Jessica next or
it could
anybody
be
else.
possibly that we could do a prequel,
Yeah.
but yeah, I have never tried to write a series or that type of stuff. So, but it'd be great if I could do a sequel, but it is not, unfortunately not going to happen on this one.
So what's next for you before we end?
Well, I'm not
What's your
sure.
next book and when am I getting it?
Well, I've been slowly trying to get into it a little bit. My thought was about a stage music magician and his trauma after trauma that happens in his life, and he starts to think about magic in general. Is magic just trickery, smoke and mirrors, or is it something parapsychology would look at? It's kind of the weird scientific stuff that's not proven, or does it have something to do with religion? What kind of
Hmm.
magic is it that we're dealing with here? So that's kind of, he's trying to tie all that stuff together. But it's I've been trying to get a little bit more into it, and so that's kind of the theme that I've been shooting for on that, and so that's hopefully the next one.
Well, I have to tell you, you have the best publicist in the whole world.
Well, thank you. I'll let them
I'm
know
serious.
that.
Shirley, I won't tell you how many. I reviewed one of her books, and I've already got just about every author that wants to be on my radio show. So you're the start, and there's a whole bunch more to come, and I'm thrilled because every book that she sends me is fantastic. There's not one that is Ivory Bones is about the Lewis Chessman series. I mean that is fantastic the way she did that. And I've got a whole bunch that I'm waiting for her to confirm in May, like about 10 more. It's like they're keeping me very busy, which is great.
Well, that's good. Yeah, we all have to
And
be
I'm
busy,
hopefully,
otherwise,
if
yeah,
and when I write my next book, I hope, as soon as
yeah.
I get it all together, I'm going to ask her to be my publicist because
Okay.
because my publicist for my book did nothing. I write horror, voices from beyond, 9 stories about people. What happens if you do the wrong thing? You don't repent. You end up as a face in the mirror, reliving it forever. And they've done nothing. But this is great. I thank you so much. Are you? And the next time you decide to write a book, make sure I get it, please.
I will do that, Fran. Also, let me give you a web page
Where
if
are
that's
you?
okay. It's www.leelindauer.com, and it's very simple. It's Lee, Lee, and Lindauer, which is Linda with a UER after the end. So it's LeeLindauer.com.
The first thing I'm going to do after is I'm going to download the video on my phone, make sure I save it, put it on my notepad with the other eight. This is the ninth one I've done. This is the ninth stream, and I'm getting used to it.
Yeah,
Actually, this is the best thing that ever happened to me, and thank you so much for joining us today.
and I appreciate
Everybody,
it.
have a great day, and it's sunny outside. And bye. I'm going to end the stream.